Bonsoir. Nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue à cette rencontre que nous avons souhaité proposer en hommage au poète américain Charles Reznikoff, poète du XXe siècle, né à Brooklyn en 1894, de parents juifs ayant fui les pogroms russes. Aussi, Charles Reznikoff, marcheur invétéré des rues de New York, compulseur d'annales de jurisprudence et d'histoire. Charles Reznikoff laisse derrière lui, à sa disparition en 1976, une œuvre encore peu connue, mais qui fascine par l'humilité de ses motifs, révélant un tableau social de dépouillement enraciné dans un paysage diasporique. C'est une œuvre qui fascine aussi par l'équivoque de son écriture, une exploration générique qui met en cause les contours de ce que nous appelons le lyrique, tout en célébrant le monde sensible. Cette vision de concrétude poétique est celle par laquelle Reznikoff est souvent présenté par la critique, sous l'étiquette d'objectiviste, aux côtés des poètes George Oppen, Carl Rakosi, Louis Zukofsky et Lorine Niedecker. Écriture, réceptacle de l'expérience, la poétique reznikoffienne met en jeu la construction de la mémoire, dimension centrale de sa poétique, s'attachant de manière saisissante à ses œuvres majeures, Témoignage les États-Unis, 1885-1915, Récitatif, et Holocaust. La matière de cette œuvre, ses dispositifs et ses thèmes rencontrent en France, à la fin des années 60, un accueil passionné par la critique et par les poètes. On pense d'abord à Serge Fauchereau et plus tard aux contributions d'Emmanuel Aucard, Claude Royer-Journeau, Yves Desmano, Emmanuel Laugier, Jean-Marie Glaise, Franck Lebovici, pour n'en citer que quelques noms. Chez son lectorat français, peu vaste mais hétéroclite, l'intérêt pour Reznikoff semble se renouveler par périodes de manière constante depuis le début des années 80 et les premières traductions de Jacques Roubaud chez POL en 1981 ou celles de Jean-Paul Oxemery quelques années plus tard dans la revue marseillaise Banana Split. Le lectorat de Reznikoff continue à être bien servi par des traductions, celles de Marc Cholodenko, Jill Silberstein, Deva Dantonikov et les traductions relativement récentes de Thierry Guéliboeuf aux éditions Nous ou d'André Markovitch aux éditions Une. L'héritage, puisqu'il s'agit bien de ça ce soir, chez les poètes contemporains, l'héritage du poète dans les pratiques contemporaines, l'héritage qui se transmet souvent par le biais de ces traductions est ce que nous sommes désireux d'explorer avec vous ce soir, grâce à l'accueil généreux de la Maison de la Poésie. Nous avons la chance d'avoir pu réunir un bel ensemble de poètes qui participent au débat conduit en ce moment dans un colloque à Nanterre dédié à Reznikoff, le premier colloque au monde consacré uniquement à ce poète si important. Certains de ces poètes sont ici pour nous faire entendre les résonances de cette œuvre dans leur propre création. C'est un ensemble de poètes francophones, anglophones et hispanophones que nous avons invités par petits groupes. Vous avez déjà un premier groupe à ma gauche. Nous allons les inviter à venir par petits groupes sur scène pour lire un choix de poèmes. Les poètes parleront par ordre alphabétique. Pas de jaloux. Alors, si vous souhaitez lire la présentation biographique et bibliographique de chaque poète, vous êtes invité à consulter le programme de la soirée qui a été distribué à l'entrée. Je prends quelques instants pour vous dire qu'il y a eu quelques petites redistributions parmi nos invités à signaler. Tout d'abord, le poète américain Michael Heller était contraint, hélas, à annuler son voyage depuis New York. Mais Sarug, Sarano, traducteur de Reznikoff, poète latino-américain, nous fait le plaisir de joindre notre distribution. Nous venons d'apprendre également que Sonia Ciambretto ne pourra pas être parmi nous également ce soir. Alors, notre premier groupe à ma gauche est composé de Dara Barnat, Norman Finkelstein et Stephen Fredman. Alors, ils vont venir chacun à leur tour devant vous pour lire leur choix de poèmes. Alors, je vous laisse le microphone. Dara.
Thank you, Fiona, and all of you. It's an absolute honor to be here tonight. It's my first time in France and in Paris, and although I feel a connection here, I have a close colleague who has done some of the translation of my poems into French, which happens to be in this collection. So I'm going to be reading a little bit from this bilingual collection, but in the English. I come to this reading through the lens of Reznikoff, particularly thinking about the poetry of place. Reznikoff was, of course, a poet of the city, especially New York City, nature too, but certainly the urban. Now, for me, I have lived in Tel Aviv, Israel, for upwards of about 20 years. I'm a lecturer of poetry and creative writing at Tel Aviv University. And, like any poet, I guess, I absorb my surroundings, and I find myself very much, when I write, working through the listing, working through these details that Reznikoff would capture so beautifully and so sharply in his poems, especially his New York poems. So I'm going to read just actually two poems. One is from a chapbook that's called The City I Run From, Poems of Tel Aviv. And it's titled, These Are the Sidewalks of Tel Aviv. And it's after a poem that's called A Postcard from Tel Aviv by the Hebrew language Israeli poet Tuvia Rubner. These are the bike lanes. They're close to the sidewalks. Be careful. This is the square where someone who cared about peace was killed. They painted his footsteps black where he fell. I push the stroller past them every day. My son plays in the shadow of peace. This is the city that holds me as I sleep and as I lay awake. People walk their dogs at 3 a.m. In this city, when I hear helicopters, I stop what I'm doing. When you hear more than one, it's serious. I don't know why I keep returning to this city that's never been my own. Find me a place that speaks my mother tongue. Find me a home in Queens. Find me a home in Brooklyn. Why Tel Aviv hot, no rain until December? Yet I live to feel those drops, to watch a downpour through the window. Is that why I've come back again? Because Tel Aviv keeps me waiting? This is the city I run towards, then from, then towards, and still from. No matter how many years go by on these streets, they're foreign. Brodetsky, Zeitlin, Ibn Gvirol. When I drive, though, I don't have to think about where I'm going. My body knows where to turn, which intersections to avoid. Maybe I hold on to Tel Aviv because this is the city that wrote me my first poems in a language it doesn't know very well. Graffiti in English is often misspelled, like the Messiah is coming. I doubt the Messiah is coming. Tel Aviv doesn't care enough. Tel Aviv cares about vegetables from the shuk, perfect tomatoes, perfect pita hummus, green olives for my son. Tel Aviv cares about cold coffee and museums. Here's the white sand on the beach. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. I've stood there in the early morning alone. The water changes by the hour. And the second poem I'll read is actually, I wrote this a little bit earlier than the one in the chapbook. And I think I trace it back to Reznikoff, a little bit also in the details and the capturing of a place, but also stylistically in the sharpness of the lines. And the connection to poetry itself, to the act of writing poetry, and also to loss of a father. This poem is about the loss of my father. Reznikoff wrote also, of course, of the loss of his mother. So this poem is titled, What Luck to Live On. Then I'm awake in the hour when birds are silent, and your voice curls in the room like smoke. You say, how lucky I am to be waiting for you, like a tree waits for its fruit in the fall. In the meantime, I'm reading every book I didn't get to read. Whitman, Dickinson, Frost. I'm sitting with my feet up, pipe in my mouth, and a plate of heirloom tomatoes with salt. I tell jokes I never got to tell. Why do bullfrogs stand on the outfield? So they won't miss a fly. I'm waiting to teach you what I never did, about Orion and Libra, the North Star, about the Pacific Ocean and its wild currents. Did you know that even when someone's ashes are poured into those currents, their spirit remains whole? Well, sit with your friend Suzanne. She looks as you remember, her blonde hair like lemon peels, and she is sorry she took those pills. And Richard, he planted a huge garden for you to walk through with silver and gold roses, petals the size of hands, green ivy that winds into infinity, yellow snapdragons that smell like sugar and chocolate and cherry. And your grandfather, he takes pictures of the light that is warm and soft and soothes you. When you arrive, tell me all that's happened since I left. I've been with you, but I want to hear you speak about every place you lived, about the apartment in Tel Aviv on Gnesin Street with blue peeling walls, the apartment on Chernyakhovsky Street and Zeitlin Street with pink mimosa trees in bloom. Tell me about the places you traveled, the heat of South Africa, the mountains of Sinai that seemed to be on fire, the white beaches, the sun that made your skin brown as a chestnut like when you were a child, the silverfish that swam beside you in the Red Sea, and the tall minaret in Cairo that you climbed step by step in the dark, the sun setting red over the city at the top. I want to hear about that shade of red. I want to know who held your hand on that trip, about every broken heart you've ever had, about every heart you've broken, about every transgression. Tell me about that day in June when you got married under an olive tree and a breeze pushed the veil from your face. I want to know how it felt walking towards the man you chose who slid a gold band onto your finger and broke a glass with his foot. Tell me about the shattering. Tell me about the hours of your wedding. Sing the notes of songs that played. I want to sing them myself. Tell me about how you and he fought. Tell me about the times you said you'd leave him and about the night you left and did not think you'd go back. Tell me what made you go back and return your clothes to the closet and your books to your desk. Tell me about your work, what you found in libraries. Tell me about the words you wrote, why you chose them, why you arranged them this way or that on the page. Teach me about Walt Whitman. I don't know enough about poetry. I don't know enough about metaphor or about how writing poems is creating art from pain. Tell me how it was after I was gone. I'm sorry I wasn't there to comfort you. Tell me who was there to comfort you. When we arrive, we'll have little except time. Do not fear the rushing of life forward, whether your life is wide like a river or narrow like a creek. What matters is how deep you believe your life to have been. When you were a child, I'd tell you a story about giant lily pads that one day we'd sit on cross-legged. Here there are thousands floating on water. Eons and eons we'll have, and never again will we be drifting away. Let the world forget us. We live on, and I say, what luck to live on. Thank you.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here. My name is Norman Finkelstein. In 1974, when I was an undergraduate at the University of New York at Binghamton, word got around among the young students who were interested in poetry that there was this old guy who was coming to read, and he was really something, and it turned out to be Charles Reznikoff. I had never read a word of Reznikoff's work, but I recall very vividly how intense and pleasurable that reading was. It was only some years later that I began to read him seriously, but I became increasingly interested in writing criticism on Jewish American poetry, and Reznikoff is central to that tradition. And lo and behold, here we have been at a conference on his work in Nanterre. It's quite extraordinary, quite a trip. I'm going to read, speaking of trips, a sequence from a recent book called In a Broken Star. In 2017, my wife and I took a trip through the capitals of Central Europe. We hit Berlin, Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. About 3 nights in each city just to kind of get a taste of them. And I had decided that I would try to write a sequence of poems apropos of that trip while traveling. And it turned out that, one, I was very interested in visiting the Jewish sites, the synagogues, some of them, of course, which had been destroyed during the Holocaust. And I also found, and I think this is not accidental, that I was writing very much in the style of the objectivists, keeping Reznikoff very much in mind. So these poems, I mean, objectivist poetry has been a very important part of my own poetic styling for many years, but these poems are about as Reznikoffian as I get. So it's a sequence. They don't have titles. The whole poem is called In a Broken Star. I'll just pause very, very briefly between the sequences, or between the poems. In a broken star, the words fall into the words, but the machine says, blow across my screen, and the letters rise up and become a page upon a page, crossing the centuries. The machine says, look, and you will understand. A tiny book in a space cut into, a foreigner carrying in the crook of his arm a tiny book. A miniature scroll in a space cut into, on longing, narratives of the miniature, the gigantic, the souvenir, the collection. And on the gigantic canvas, dolls' dresses, girls' dresses, or a figure impaled by shards of glass, its head a tree of emanations. A single girder in the worn brick wall, beneath the exposed rusted column, the eternal lamp found beneath the concrete, marble fragments, faded golden stars. House of names, house of the dead. We walked out into the sunshine, walked into the cemetery's shade, whimsy and horror, photos and souvenirs. This is the truth, the whole truth, holy and whole, written in clay that comes to life, comes into life, fallen clay, fallen figure, comes and goes from life into life. On Doheny Street, a silver willow in the fenced courtyard past the graves. The guides in the sanctuary, speaking French, speaking Hebrew, regale the tourists. The puppet master on all the billboards tells us nothing has really changed. The puppet master was Soros, was all over Budapest. And vistas, eternal vistas, internal vistas on which to brood. The sunlight on the rivers, bridges and palaces, cathedrals on which to brood. Crowds on the banks, blood on the banks, eternal vistas, internal vistas on which to brood. Sometimes the poem is a kiss upon the cheek, sometimes a blow to the back of the skull. But the music there is always perfect in the ancient basement or gilded hall. The cymbalum and violin in the ruin bars and elegant restaurants, so that the poem wanders off, dazed by love, wounded by hatred, while the music plays on. Ships and sultans, triumphal cars, stags, satyrs, and goddesses enthroned. The musicians and the cogwheels behind the musicians all come to life with a golden key. The door opens. A peasant drops his pants, farts melodiously, while the arrows fly, the cannons fire, the centaurs charge. This purse is filled with coins, with gems. Here comes the devil. Better run away. We are all sepia photos on a napkin ring. We are all on the stairwell caught by the maidservant. There are so many of us here in the apartment, so many of us in the crimson waiting room. I was glued to the steps and unable to budge from the spot. So that's my tour of the capitals of Europe. I'm going to read one more poem, which is a kind of collage-like piece, and it's called Desert, and it's an earlier engagement, partly with objectivist poetics and partly with the Jewish dimension of objectivist poetics, which really, I think, has to do very much with a kind of absent God. So this is a kind of God-wrestling poem. And it has two epigraphs, one from Harvey Shapiro, wonderful poet who could be understood as a kind of second-generation objectivist. The pronomial outcry, as if uttered in ecstasy, is turned to syntax. And then another from George Oppen, the world cried out above the mountain. Clouded sky filled with letters, Hebrew letters stretching to the horizon, pale stripe of blue. Inscribed desert floor reaching to the base of the many-peaked mountain, striated and brown. Fire as tall as the mountain, pure red, more spirit than fire, shadow on sand. No one climbing these peaks, no one guided by this pillar of flame, no one crossing these sands, no one seeking meaning in this sky. Shadow and flame and peaks like knives, the letters rearrange themselves again and again, not meaning but the promise of meaning, not events in time, but time to hold all events. And to have come a long way, always thinking about the voices, the promises, reiterations, charges, and declarations, the stories the voices told, and the stories told about the voices. Called back, returned, and so went forth again. From the edge of the abyss, the deep places of the imagination, retrieved, rescued, redeemed, fronted, confronted, conspired, conspired against, usurped, stolen, sacrificed, bidden, forbidden, dreamed, prophesied, spoke to, with, against, visited, was visited upon, throned, dethroned, written upon the sky and upon the ground. Neither upon the sky nor upon the ground, neither in the desert nor at the mountain, neither in the heights nor in the depths, neither present nor absent, neither known nor unknown, neither strange nor familiar, neither whole nor in fragments, neither revealed nor hidden, neither sacred nor profane, neither spoken nor silent. And you, once the image fades, the screen goes blank, do you still hover above the whole picture, beyond the numbers that program, the letters that inscribe, the voice that speaks this desert world? Thanks.
Bonsoir. My name is Stephen Fredman. I'm very happy to be here, both in Paris and at this wonderful celebration of Charles Reznikoff, whom, like Norman, I saw once at a poetry reading, only mine was on the West Coast in San Francisco, at San Francisco State University, also in 1974. And at that reading were a number of other wonderful poets. The director of the Poetry Center at that time was Kathleen Fraser, and the introducer of this reading was the poet George Oppen. And as I was sitting in the audience, I noticed to my left there was the poet Robert Creeley. So as Reznikoff read his remarkable poems and kept stopping every once in a while to say, "Do you want to hear another poem?" I looked over to Robert Creeley, who was becoming more and more animated and excited, and finally said, "Yes, yes, this is it. That's what poetry is. This is it. This is it." I was absolutely astonished. And I thought maybe my memory of this event had been in some way enlarged over the years, and that I had really not been that close to Robert Creeley and must have imagined his reaction. And there's actually a videotape that was made of this reading. And at the very end, after Reznikoff finishes reading, the stationary camera, which at that point was all one had, starts to pan the audience, and it comes back around and around and around, and there's Robert Creeley. And behind him, there's Stephen Fredman. So I was there. At any rate, I was so lucky to actually hear Reznikoff read and to see the reaction of one of my other poetic heroes. So what I'm going to read for you tonight are two memory pieces from a book called Pass Through. The first one is called Presser. When I was 13, just after my bar mitzvah, I became obsessed with the Holocaust. That summer, I worked in seedy downtown San Diego in my step-grandfather's locker club, where sailors stationed in the bay could store the civvies they weren't allowed to keep aboard ship. My job was to sit on a high wooden stool at the front counter, take in dirty laundry, write up a ticket, and give it to the man in front of me. Behind me was the presser, a former sailor with cut-off sleeves to show his bulging biceps and the tattoos up and down his arms. On the counter before me, that entire summer, was William L. Shirer's 1,200-page history, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which I brought in each day and read from cover to cover, my breath punctuated by hissing steam from the pressing machine behind me. The steam and the tattoos were parts of the book come to life, and I felt there was no escape from being a hunted Jew. When I was younger, I loved reading about heroes like King Arthur and his knights, and I believed I could easily be one of them. Now I was reading about victims, and it seemed much more realistic that I could be one of them. How would I slip past the Nazis? The Yiddish phrases that spiced my grandmother's conversation, es gesundheit, eat it in good health, oi weh mir, oh woe is me, were shibboleths that would give us all away. The rank smells of soiled laundry in her husband's locker club made my gorge rise. And downstairs, among the lockers, were icky condom machines. Books were where I went to hide from the outside world, but here the pungent lives of men penetrated the covers. There was no way out. The second piece is called Stumblestones. A few years ago at the University of Notre Dame in a faculty seminar on translating poetry, a German colleague said that even while living in the US and speaking English, his dreams were always in German. I blurted out, "My nightmares are in German." He laughed and said he understood, but I blushed and felt ashamed. What right had I to bring up German guilt and my own fears to someone who wasn't even born during World War II? Later, an invitation came to speak in Berlin. I accepted with trepidation, not sure I could overcome the fear and revulsion I felt about Germany. Before traveling, I watched a favorite film, Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire, in which a yearning angel tumbles into the emotions and sensations of mortal life right next to the Berlin Wall. Drawn to the wall during my week in Berlin, I sought out the ruined sections of it still standing with its potent Cold War graffiti. As much as possible, though, I avoided Holocaust tourism. There was an exhibition along several blocks where the wall had stood of metal placards on stanchions, pointing out where neighboring houses were leveled for no man's land and where bricks had lately been set in the ground to show the paths of tunnels that had been dug to escape to the west. It told the stories of people who made it across and those who didn't. Above the skyline of the present city, huge cranes seemed to peer down at an unending building boom. At street level, however, strange stencils and bright colors on buildings flashed into sight, and little humanoid figurines were tucked up among girders on bridges. Walking in the Charlottenburg neighborhood, I noticed 4 brass squares raised slightly above the cobblestones. Each one bore the name of a family member who lived there, a father and mother and 2 children, along with their birth years and the date all were murdered in a camp. These Stolpersteine, stumblestones, want you to stub your toe on the names and fates of individual people. When I read about this long-running public art project, I was struck by what a volunteer had to say. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. Some of the American poets whom I came to know closely had also stumbled on the logic that bound stones to personal fate. One day in 1973, for instance, when I went to see Robert Duncan at his home on 20th Street in San Francisco's Mission District, he handed me a printed sheet and told me he had just returned from learning to set type with Wesley Tanner, proprietor of the Arif Press in Berkeley. And the poem reads, I had hoped to show it to you. Oh, next slide, please. I can show it to you. Perfect, great. February 22nd, 1973, time to return to Gertrude Stein, to the hesitating glitter of the stone that breaks along the line of ancient fault. And you see the inscription there, for Stephen, proof copy 1 of 5, before printing of 5 on watercolor paper. Stein is stone in German. Gertrude Stein was a touchstone for Duncan throughout his career, and he spent years imitating her astonishing lapidary technique with words. Many Jewish Steins were originally given the surname because they were jewelers who cut and polished and set precious stones. And then there were the silver Steins and the gold Steins, and those whose specialty was amber, the Bernsteins, burnt stones. Names and languages and ethnicities and genders break like stones along the line of ancient fault. And Duncan's poetic compatriot Robert Creeley saw human experience as at once utterly common and irreducibly individual. His favorite pronoun was one, which feels both singular and plural, personal and impersonal. In his poem, The Plan is the Body, he builds the common out of the singular, all the time pleading for the integrity of the breakable body. The rhythm of one and one and one and one, the two, the three, the plan is the body. Thank you.
Alors, merci d'accueillir ensuite avec moi Andrea Inglese, Jena Osman, Ariel Reznikoff et Sarug Sarano.
Bonsoir. Il y a pire, il y a même des poètes italiens qui ont été traduits en français et qui ont découvert Reznikoff et qui ont découvert que au moment où ils ont vraiment découvert Reznikoff et qu'ils aiment Reznikoff, ils se sont dit qu'à l'époque où ils ne connaissaient pas Reznikoff, peut-être ils écrivaient un petit peu sous l'influence de Reznikoff. Je vais commencer avec un texte de Reznikoff, de Inscription, traduit par Thierry Gilbeuf. Te Deum. Ce n'est pas à cause des victoires que je chante, n'en ayant importé aucune, mais pour le soleil ordinaire, la brise, la largesse du printemps. Ce n'est pas pour la victoire, mais pour le travail quotidien accompli de mon mieux. Ce n'est pas pour un siège sous le dais, mais à la table ordinaire. Je vais lire des poèmes qui ont été publiés en français par Le Clou dans le Fer, un livre qui s'appelle Colonne d'aveugle et qui a été traduit de l'italien par Pascal Leclerc. Vie. Je ne peux pas ne pas raconter mon histoire. J'appelle ça des astres autobiographiques. Devoir se fabriquer une histoire, aller l'extraire comme une écharde entre les tissus fragiles de la peau, au risque d'un émiettement. La faire naître, imprimer une lenteur exaspérante à cette chose jamais arrivée, jamais aplanie, à ce X pulvérisé, interrompu, instantané, pour lequel il y a des environs à perte de vue, des nébuleuses qui cernent, avec lesquelles on a un encerclement infini, sans possibilité de s'approcher, de dire un enfant, moi, ma peau, chute sur le gravier. Pour compenser, il y a des radiographies, beaucoup, à partir de 4 ans. Il reste les cahiers des colliers, les couvertures des cahiers, il reste des environs, des passages documentés, de souches. De quelle histoire on parle, ce n'est pas clair. La rendre mienne, c'est ralentir, fournir le contre-document de l'antérieur, de la nuit du X, fournir quelque chose du centre, inventer qu'il y ait un centre, en mettant en perspective et symétrie et succession, en comparant tous les plaies, les points de suture. Cette blessure est le côté interne de ce qui, dehors, est pure trace, pur retard, perte, document, registre d'état civil. Appareil. Je me réveille la nuit et je pense, il doit y en avoir, il est nécessaire qu'il y en ait. Et je me mets un schéma alors que tout autour il fait noir. C'est impossible qu'il n'y en ait pas. Et je les cherche. Je commence, me promenant la nuit, à les chercher, un par un, les appareils de mon appartement. À tâtons, j'avance, aidé de plus petits appareils, illuminant des zones circonscrites dans l'espace. Je les éclaire, les petites et grandes cuirasses deviennent évidentes, certaines muettes, d'autres par un très léger tremblement de paupières. Il suffit de poser doucement le bout des doigts, les infimes, chaudes vibrations, les oscillations internes des mécanismes les plus réduits, quasi organiques, concentrés derrière et en profondeur, les moteurs, les ventilateurs, la circulation des liquides, la pression des gaz. Je les passe tout en revue, en pointant ma torche, touchant de la pulpe des doigts les appareils de mon appartement. La nuit, dans mes allées et venues, je regarde, même si j'en connais les silhouettes par cœur, leur disposition dans les coins, dans les armoires, dans les ouvertures des parois, les appareils, les petits comme les grands, actifs ou inactifs, en couronne, en cercle, en toile d'araignée, comme ils me tiennent en vie, comme ils me donnent vie, comme ils me retirent le sommeil, dans leur splendeur en sourdine, dans le travail clandestin, continu, empoisonnant et maintenant en vie empoisonnée, la vie. Citron. Il y a des endroits de l'appartement inhabitables, d'autres presque trop habités, des chaises sur lesquelles il est vain de s'asseoir ou impossible de penser ou d'adopter une position de vertébré adulte. Jour après jour, les mètres carrés promis par l'agence raccourcissent, mais sans dessin, mal à propos. Devant, il n'y a pas de ciel, des miroirs d'existence dans le cadre fixe de la fenêtre. Nuit ou matin, c'est la même chose. La cuisine immobile qu'anime de temps en temps la petite vieille, avalant sa soupe à la cuillère, ses doigts émiettant des atomes de pain. Ou la femme qui astique des heures durant les sanitaires, puis allongée, érantée, sous le nuage bleuté de l'écran. Ou la plus jeune qui, avant de dormir, enfile devant le miroir l'entièreté de sa garde-robe en solitaire. Les citrons sont par ici, un tas, dans le plat afghan, prêts à tomber, déformés, gros comme des patates, avec, sur l'écorce rugueuse, l'autocollant DAC et la marque déposée. C'est le maghrébin le moins cher qui nous les a vendus. De toute évidence, c'est elle qui les boit, dans de l'eau froide ou chaude, pour rien, pour être sûr, pour la santé. Moi, je prends les pelures difformes, pressées, je regarde dans les alvéoles où se trouvait le jus, je regarde leur petite vide dans les yeux. Image. Je dois encore te parler de ça, la fenêtre. Des toilettes est brisée. Il reste ébréché le contour des pointes fichées encore dans le châssis en bois. Dans ma chambre, une fissure horizontale a fait gonfler l'enduit. Dans la pièce à côté, le parquet est criblé d'interminables griffes, comme s'il avait été parcouru par un étourdi d'animal ongulé. Dans les 2 toilettes, il faudra arracher la couche de linoléum aux grands fleurs jaunes imprimées. À ceci, je voudrais ajouter l'image de l'arbre et du vent, sans décider si c'est un chêne ou un noisetier, s'il vient le soir ou le matin, si tu peux avoir l'écorce en la grattant, ou si ça fait trembler l'ourlet de tes pantalons. Et cette photo aussi, tirée d'un livre pour enfants, sérieux, les pieds du pharaon, sans bandelette, dans des sandales dorées, ses gros orteils, encapuchonnés dans un léger revêtement d'or, la saillie du tarse, derrière le voile de la chair séchée. N'oublie pas que les Poncas sur le fleuve Niobrara cultivaient du maïs et des potagers, survécurent à la petite vérole de l'homme blanc, mais en 1877 furent déplacés comme du bétail sur des centaines de kilomètres et beaucoup moururent en chemin. Je vois l'image de la mauvaise nourriture et des couvertures miteuses qui leur furent données à prix d'or à l'arrivée par les entrepreneurs blancs travaillant dans les réserves. La dernière image est celle de l'arrière-grand-père, un employé de petite taille, aux yeux cireux. Il fut incorporé dans le génie des terrassiers durant la Grande Guerre. Il revint du Carso avec un éclat de grenade incrusté dans le crâne. Chez lui, il avait des malaises. Un jour, il frappa jusqu'au sang sa femme et ses 2 filles. Tous ces mots changeront encore la consistance des images. Puis, ils le consommeront. Et il restera le peu qu'il reste, juste en face, à voir. Merci.
I'm going to read 2 poems. Both have been written with the permission of Reznikoff's testimony. That book is what has influenced a lot of my work with found text. And whereas Reznikoff in testimony was making poems out of language selected from court cases in the lower courts in the United States from the turn of the 20th century, much of the language that I am using in these 2 poems is taken from Supreme Court cases, United States Supreme Court cases from the 21st century. So this first poem is called The Beautiful Life of Persona Ficta, and some of the language inside of it is taken from a case called Citizens United versus the United States. And this case is known for giving corporations the constitutional right of free speech. A corporation is to a person as a person is to a machine. Friends of the court, we know them as good and bad. They too are sheep and goats ventriloquizing the ghostly fiction. A corporation is to a body as a body is to a puppet. Putting it in caricature, if there are natural persons, then there are those who are not that, buying candidates. There are those who are strong on the ground and then weak in the air, weight shifts to the left leg while the propaganda arm extends. A corporation is to an individual as an individual is to an uncanny valley, the separation of individual wills from collective wills, magic words. They create an eminent body that is different from their own selves, reach over with the open palm of the left and force to the right, while pamphlets disengage. A corporation has convictions as a person has mechanical parts. making a hash of the statute, the state is a body. Dobson, Hobson, and Jobson are masquerading under an alias. Push off with the right foot, and at the same time step forward with the left foot. Childlike voice complements visual cues and contributes to cuteness factor of the contestational robot. A corporation has likes and dislikes as a body has shareholders. Bound by precedents, the spectral then showed himself for what he was, a blotch to public discourse. The right foot is immediately brought forward. The body flattens toward the deck rather than leap into the air. It is not a hop. Subversive literature engaged. A corporation gives birth as a natural human births profit margins. Some really weird interpretations, fully panoplied for war, a myth. Torso breaks slightly forward. The hand is not entirely supine, but sloping from the thumb about 30 degrees. Head rotation and sonar sensing technologies are employed to create believable movement while allowing for only the most limited interaction. A corporation has an enthusiasm for ethical behavior, as a creature has economic interests only. Facial challenges. This person, which is not a human being, not a physical personality of mankind, custom built from aluminum stock. A corporation is we the people, as a person is a cog. A funny kind of thing, naive shareholders. Where there is property, there is no personality. Take off in full stride. Lead leg exaggerates the knee lift of a normal stride. Cordless microphones, remote control systems, hidden tape recorders. A corporation has a conscience, as a body has a human likeness. Forceful lily, so difficult to tell the two apart. Paralyze the wheels of industry, an insatiable monster, soulless and conscienceless, a fund. A corporation says, hey, I'm talking to you, as an individual speaks through a spokesperson. They wear a scarlet letter that says see, rejecting a century of history, the strong over the weak, better armed, supernatural, richer, more numerous. These are the facts. A corporation admires you from afar and then has the guts to approach you and ask you for your number as a being activates a cognitive mechanism for selecting mates. It is a nightmare that Congress endorsed. Mega corporation as human group, the realm of hypothesis. A corporation warms the bed and wraps its arms around you and just wants to spoon as a natural human wants to organize profits. It's overbroad, a glittering generality, a fiction to justify the power of the strong invented by prophets of force. There were narrower paths to incorporeal rights. A corporation has upstanding character as a body has photorealistic texture. The absorptive powers of some prehistoric sponge. There are good fictions and bad fictions. Can the fiction ever disappear? And the second poem that I'm going to read is, I wrote last summer. It begins with two epigraphs. The title of the poem is Dissent and the Hydra. And the first epigraph is from Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. It was from his leaked draft of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is the decision that ultimately did away with the right to an abortion in the United States. And that epigraph is guided by the history and tradition that map the essential components of our nation's concept of ordered liberty, we must ask what the 14th Amendment means by the term liberty. And the second epigraph is from Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from a case called Shelby County versus Holder, which essentially got rid of the Voting Rights Act in the United States. And that quote is, "Early attempts to cope with this vile infection resembled battling the Hydra." And the language from this poem is a combination of words that I've culled from both of these cases, as well as a deep dive into the Oxford English Dictionary definition of hydra. We turn our collars up against the chill of raw judicial power. The fabulous many-headed snake of the marshes of Lerna. It is said that if one head is smite, 3 heads grow. A rancorous national controversy of spring-headed hydras and sea-shouldering whales. Members of the court split 3 ways. Gestational age ministers life to this monstrous hydra. We make a long list of circuit conflicts to cope with this vile infection. We are a quick child. We expect more from an opinion striking at the heart. Had we as many mouths as hydra, our answer would stop them all. For liberty is a capacious term, a jettisoned framework, an animated hiss and whistling wail. Hydra assailants return every hour, yet their cuts produce in time a perfect animal. Hubris is a fit word for today's demolition of a deeply rooted right full of hydras and crocodiles. This scheme of ordered liberty is the court's own brainchild, poison fumes, poisoned blood, in a long constellation with a few bright stars. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Hey everyone, my name is Ariel Reznikoff. Charles Reznikoff was my grandfather's first cousin. And when I was growing up, we called him Uncle Charles, though I never met him. And at a young age, I started telling my parents that I wanted to be an artist, not a writer, but a painter or a musician or a photographer, different times. And their response was always the same. You can be like your Uncle Charles. You become a lawyer, and then you get successful as a lawyer, and then you can be an artist. My parents really had no idea who Charles Reznikoff was. They misinterpreted his biography completely. He was a lawyer who never practiced law and was, in fact, an extraordinary poet, and certainly not a poet as a hobby, but as he described it, you know, poetry was his discipline. The closest thing he had to sort of a religiosity was poetry. So I'm going to read 3 poems from a new chapbook, which is called Raisin in Every Bite. And that title comes from Reznikoff's platform, salmon and red wine and a cake fat with raisins, no diet for a writer of verse. Dream in East Bay. And this begins with 2 epigraphs. The small light the large, that's Rashi. And the second is, ask those Hebrew ecstatics up there on the trees of sorrow, mystic blood fruit picked in the season of the dead. That's Bob Kaufman. Bob Kaufman appears at a South Berkeley catch-out. Smells of sweet, aromatic cannabis and sweat. We meet under orange tent, blue tarp, ash cloud sky. No measure for misery in history, Bob says, turns to everybody, nobody. I come here to meet Bob in my sleep, where he meets me in poems where we speak, distemporal, whispering carbon, marks soot from former fires, fucks unceremoniously as brain touching glass. In fish eye lives, Hasidic Rebbe just behind retina. Bob snorts Talmudic rubble, bramble-bearded Bubale and zuckt mir epis zis, throats and licks a poem. In our mutual absence, the camp has been here for years, since I was born, since Bob died. With birth memory, Bob reminds me of something Cecilia taught in Oakland, in Santiago, the feeling of glacier under feet, under heat sounds of life now dripping into oblivion. One night when JG visits, Bob comes along for the ride to the camp beside the main catch-out in Emeryville, carrying a mouth harp like Charlie Murrow, sings to us in rasping acoustics, decoding a passage from Carrel, quote, what new body would be his. The voices of ghosts flooding him, behind us, fires ripping through shipping containers. Piles of disposable gloves and masks cover old mattresses. When Cecilia speaks in memory, I see in her eyes ancient footlights. I weep in my hands quietly, not to make smoke. During silent, melting icicles, hail scatters wakening snow wolves in ice forests. At villages, canary coats, where altar begs archaeoforensics reveal traces of frankincense and cannabis, not quite unfathomable as falsifying a record and calling it faith. Bob reads over ecstatic Hebrew at the far end of the camp, runs into Ashby Flea Market, a fete-like atmosphere of drummers and rough handlers, spots Kathleen pushing Larry, dear Larry, who my father speaks to in shul without knowing who he is, my father who's always checking to make sure Larry has everything he needs. He does. One night in El Cerrito, digging through photos, Larry's face in that moment, waiting for traffic to pass. In deep memory wells, poetry swells, with Bob rubbing his hands together to relieve stress, Cecilia whispering over red yarn, movement of the bayward gulls turning north of west, past San Pablo on far side of El Sobrante, yes, even that far north, where once I fell asleep at the wheel. The last camp we visit, across creeks from tracks, ugly sludge heavy lips harness earth. Still nights we spend, cracked open in air. It doesn't add up. Adjustments agitate nocturnal, caressing silk eyes, insinuous, sonorous embrace, mouth to mouth, breath to breath. Had it marked and everything. The exchange of hunger for thirst with Norma Cole. I wanted to send you a poem dedicated to Barbara Guest. In early morning dark, I get up, smash up cashews for Z, mix in raisins, peel whole apples, and Barbara's name is just there, scribbled in my handwriting. A notebook meditation, daily ritual, like marking the calendar or making the bed. We'd been calling our poems residues, imagining them in cracks and crevices, scraps as I.J. Siegel on factory tissue papers. To will the nightmare away is not the same thing as waking up from it, you said. Asleep, we awoke to a recording of Barbara reading at the Library of Congress. Quote, "It makes us see someone we love in an acre of grass." And God, did I want to respond to that call, to Barbara's cadence tuned and intoned as sliver and ram's wool, on fallow crease and bump, bump, bump its way into the poem, a yet unseated sound, resounding in atmosphere. There's always text, which sometimes soothes the pain, sometimes intensifies it. If I sent you anything at all, it was definitely coated in smashed up cashew residue. Everything is these days. We joke about joining the elephants. Beauty of our everyday movements turns streams towards streams, wandering into clouds and air. Somehow we find time to pass notes back and forth. I write my dream about you and Barbara in my notebook, but never send it, only read it to you over Zoom. And this last poem is called Ghost Canto, with and for Bernadette Mayer, who recently passed away. A list appears in parentheses with every line crossed out. What goes into the poem? My cousin's ex-husband asks what a poet is. He's read dead ones before, but never met a real live one. Didn't realize it was a living art at all. Didn't I read something in the Atlantic magazine? In Hell, the death of poetry as narrated by my cousin's Brooks Bros ex-nightmare. In the morning, Riv texts a video of Zazie riding his bimba, hot pink, not quite tricycle, singing, leaves and flowers, leaves and flowers. I put down my phone and look up to the poem, face it with curiosity, patience, and care. What do you mean by care? The chair of the search committee asks when you say care-oriented pedagogy, as if to say, am I my brother's keeper? As if to say, what is my responsibility? What does it matter in the end, whether we care or not, or about what? It matters a whole fucking lot, but you can't say that in the interview. Twist your tongue into knots, as Zooks, Coleridge's Shylock, ing prof, thou doth protest too much. In the poem, the gates open at the same moment they close. A spell gets through, not curse, but apotropaic chant, warding off the evil eye. When I heard Bernadette had died, I texted my Amish Gazebos Abroad group chat, thinking of how lucky we are to be poets, if poetry is, finally, a means and seam at double eternity, in reverse Faustian pact, just freaks being freaks. If there's no original language and we are all mediums of the dead, Bernadette was alive when I started this poem, a poet among ghosts, now ghost among poems. What Bill Berkson calls duration, the translations of her life she made remain our permission. In second body, mind aggregation, language in formation, culled by the dead for the living, the dead who live among us, and the dead we all become. Thank you.
Hello. So I discovered Charles Reznikoff in an anthology called Barbaric, Vast, and Wild. It was an anthology edited by Jerome Rothenberg, in which there appears outside and subterranean poetry. So for tonight, I'm gonna read 2 poems from 2 different authors, which I consider are also outside and subterranean poets. The first one is a Mexican author called Juan Martinez. It's one of the poems from Angel of Fire, translated from the Spanish. Slow, hard improvement in coexistence in progress. Lines originating a point upon crossing. Centers replacing opposing signs. In magnificent states. Refined sediments. In the history of eternity, anthropological ethnics softly extend its magical surprises over the passage of everyday life, affordable like a logical reasoning rose, but surmising upon intuition with the links. Trigonometric aroma by the riverside of differential, calculations in the malleability of my will, underground action at the planet roots. Mute forms, aromas, and colors transmute implicit tasks. Invisible universes interpret sidereal symphonies to perfection. Protons and electrons weave fine threads in a mystical language. Clean design compositions fertilize microgenetic systems. Clearly intelligent plasma sap determines environmental contact conditions. High precision genders and specializations, creepers, sensitive slopes. Receptors detect solar communications. Multifarious breaths emanate from their fleeing character. Where the song of the acridae, modified by its frequency, by rubbing its antennae. By way of sound waves, the message reaches the bobcat, the quail, the owl, the hawk, the eagle, and the tiger. The second poet is from Portugal. He was a famous recluse. Once he won a very important award, and when they came knocking at his door, he said, "Tell them I just died, please." So this poem is called Poem Act 2. My head trembles with all the forgetfulness. I try to say how everything is something else. I talk, I think, I dream of the tremendous bones of feet. It is always something else, a single thing covered with names. And death goes on from mouth to mouth, like slight saliva, like the fear that is always at the unformed bottom of life. I know fields imagine their own roses. People imagine their own rose fields. And sometimes I stand before the fields as if dying. And sometimes as if I only know I could wake. Sometimes everything is lit up. Sometimes it sings and bleeds. I say no one is forgiven in time. I say madness is thorny like a throat. I say autumn rolls along. But what is autumn? Eyelids lash against the big masculine day of thought. I leave dead and leaving things in the spirit of the work. My life in ecstasy like a chamber of torches. It was, how shall I say, an absolute house. I play, I swear, it was a childhood house. I know how crazy a house it was. I dipped my hands in water. I dozed off. I remembered. Mirrors cracked up against our youth. Now I feel the brutal lyrical spinning of the wheels of life. There is in forgetfulness, in the total remembrance of things, a rose like a tall head, a fish like a swift and fierce movement. A rosefish inside my misguided idea. There are cups and drunken forks inside me, because the love of things in the future tense is terribly deep. It is soft, devastating. Chairs were burning in their places. My sisters dwelt at the top of movement, like awestruck beings. Sometimes they laughed out loud. They weaved themselves into horrid darkness. Inside them, rotten menstruation dreamed of the mouth of night. It sang very low. It seemed to flow. Around tables and thunderstruck shadows. It rained on earthy nights. I want to shout beyond earthly madness. It was damp, distilled, inspired. There was rigor. Oh, extreme example. There was an essence of office, a sensational matter in the secret fruit trees, like their centripetal apples and grapes hung on ripeness. There was a cat's hot magnolia, a cat that came in through hands, or a magnolia rising out of the hand and into the face of the gloomily pure mother. Oh, crazy mother, around the corner, seatedly complete. Her hands touched the flesh over the burning like an ecstatic morsel. It was an absolute house. How shall I say? A feeling where some people would die, an insanity to smile loftily, to have blueberries, green leaves, thorns with a little darkness all over, a name in the spirit like a rose fish. I prefer to go insane under the arched halls, now in words. I prefer to sing on inner balconies, because there were staircases and women that stood honeycombed by intelligence. The rosette-less body, the language to love and to ruminate, singing milk. Now I dive and ascend like a cup. I bring up that image of inner water, the poem's pen dissolved in the primal sense of the poem, or the poem going up the pen, crossing its impulse, the returning poem. Everything rises like a nail, a raised knife. Everything dies out its name in another name. Poem not coming from the power of madness, poem as the inconcrete basis of creation. Ah, to think with tenderness, to imagine with ferocity, because I am alive with furious melancholy, with furious conception, with furious irony. I am an intelligent devastation, with fabulous marigolds, gold on top, sad dawn or midnight played on a trumpet. I am some audible, sensible thing, a movement, a chair conjuring up itself in the basin, becoming the sitting, or flowers drinking up the vase, structural silence of flowers, and the table underneath to dream. This one last poem. The source text of this poem was my immigration forms when I was living in the United States. I drew a colorless galleon on the wall and it sailed away. Case number GL393144. Returned, resubmitted, relocated, sent, relocated, received. Provide information about any departure. Have you ever been a habitual liar, one who has given weak testimony, a practicing denier, one who has ordered, incited, assisted in acts of disregard? We regret to inform you, but not really, that your request to stay within the boundaries of good and fruitful land have been utterly denied. You cannot or did not comply with the requirements. We encourage you not to apply ever again. Please leave a note before you take off your shoes, because the road ahead is a 42 long coin on its edge, just waiting for a little bad wind to push it over. What is your problem, you foreigner? There is no time for breathing when there is so much personal drowning to do. We have a list of all your names. No, you can't hide. The spin foam thinker, the creditician, the epistolary beggar, the jewel eater, all of your names, so pathetic. We will make them walk the long plank, commit them to the burning waves. Whatever couldn't nurture an emotion on land, may it feed the eager mouths at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. Not to give you any false hopes, but in their chewing you won't find relief. Do not make this about yourself. We just mistook your liver for a bank account. And now you don't get to feel the buttery morning spread on your shoulders. No, you don't get to feel light. It has all been revoked. May your passport dissolve in terrible chemicals. May you continue your non-judicial aspiration deep in slime. File to lockbox or service center, honestly, neither. You have no file, no more, no border, no name to deny. Your alien registration number has been deleted and are no longer eligible to apply for suspension of deportation. Case number GL393144. We do hereby order you to stop, for these hungry chains shall be your sufficient and only solace. Take your place in the mud. Black bile be upon your head. Thank you.
Merci d'accueillir donc le troisième et dernier groupe de poètes ce soir. Nous avons Mark Scroggins, Frank Smith et Carlos Soto roman.
It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. For the last 8 years or so, I've been at work on a long poem called Zion Off-Ramp, Bretelle de Sortie. And there's nothing much very Reznikoffian about this, except that, like many of his short poems, it often has urban environments, and like Testimony and Holocaust, it's long and rather unpleasant. So I'm going to read two sections. This is 35. There was broken glass and there was fog. There were words and sentences, books and letters, night vision, not what it used to be. High beams blinding all the pedestrians dressed in black. There was fog and mist. There was light, rain, freezing sometimes, and more sentences. I thought that if I captured them, accumulated them, put them all in one place, they'd add up to something. Underlining, scribbled notes in the margin, sometimes diagonal. P and P equals pleasure and pain over and over. Almost every page, from chest to knees, raw red, the needles and knives of the surf, carrot cloud over the forehead, cold, sweet recurrence of accepted rhymes. Measure, pleasure, gain, vain, pain. My nightingale, which I have never heard, is a seagull, a seamew, which I have never heard. Needles and knives of the rollers, mockingbird under the wave. Scholiast and skyalist, asleep in the scriptorium, copying for centuries the same eye skip. Figure for fugue, rags for rage, mile walk for a pint of bitter suburban prose, suburban marginalia. He spoke again and again to one she, name never named, named with a dozen different names. 2 horses riding down that beach, sea mist and sea foam, the cold brown scum shifts back and forth in the shallows, harder to see with high beams in the fog, putting together, lining up the names and unnames, try to fix them to one she, one person. Seabirds speak a bitter, clipped language, lands, forlorn, sunburnt mirth, play-acting pain, making mouths at pleasure. Biting's no use. Books, virginibus puerisque on any suburban coffee table in a pleasant place, pleasant, embossed, binding, the press, the screw, pages uncut, damp and dry, heat, warped, love of a cousin, love of a close relation, the book and the whipping block, adolescent, childish, arrested, measure, pleasure, pain, again. Who hears, who reads, to whom do I speak? Postcard, which always reaches the proper address. C, canceled, postmarked, letterpress, offset, swimming pool of papers written and printed and speaking one melodious word. No birds sing, no birds there. Was fog, there was mist, icy needles. And 46, dead end, cul-de-sac. In the builded place, that's a nod to Mike Heller, who can't be here. In the builded place, the island set thick with masonry, brick, concrete, steel, and asphalt, crowded with harsh density, alive with buzzing movement. This building is called the Plaza, this the Dakota. The name of that building, she said, is the ugliest building in Manhattan. Maybe it has no name. Its only saving grace, she said, is that when there's fog and rain, it's completely invisible. The lights of the bridge, a necklace strung between the heights and the palisades, improbable, vertiginous distance, shouldered in among the semis and SUVs at twilight. We see the island curve off on one hand like a dove-gray Xanadu set with blinking, popping, and steady jewels. Has it worked? After all these years of planning and calculating, have we stopped fearing and trembling? I cross these bridges now without a second thought that once had me holding my breath, hands sweating on the steering wheel. After all these years, nothing won, hardly or otherwise, nothing to be brought out as the hard-won prize, no grand summa or synthesis, nothing really to say. Remarkably light cargo to end a 3 decades voyage. My name, they say, is Dawn, or maybe Don. I need $1 or $2. My truck's over there with my granddaughter and significant other. We're out of gas. I'm 53, never used, never hustled. 53 shows only in the close-cropped white hair. No lines, no cracks. Intricate and small, closely worked, inked lines just visible beneath glazes of color, paint melted to enamel, curves of ivory, white cameo on powder blue bisque, fascination of the small, attraction of the miniature gesture, hand twitching the brush, an exquisite fraction, hatched lines shading a lifetime's expression in a 1/4 inch of paper. Credo, these words, Martians gave me these words. I heard these words on the radio. The Ouija board picked them out for me. A subsonic transmission from Ghost Factory Records, from the Order of Monuments Company. These words are air, vibration, dark fluid dried on paper, ones and zeros, sparking pixels, no music at all, no flesh, asomatic words. A damsel with a dulcimer gave me these words. I found these words in the fields and only wrote them down. They followed me home, honest, and I fed them table scraps. Thank you.
Bonsoir. J'ai choisi quelques textes de Charles Reznikoff pour commencer. Dans son livre Holocauste, paru au Prétexte éditeur en 2007, et c'est traduit de l'américain par Oxemery. C'est la séquence 4 qui s'intitule Ghetto. Au début, il y avait 2 ghettos à Varsovie, un petit et l'autre grand, et entre eux, un pont. Les Polonais devaient passer sous le pont et les Juifs dessus. Et à côté se trouvaient des gardes allemands pour voir si les Juifs ne se mêlaient pas aux Polonais. Du fait des gardes allemands, tout Juif qui ne retirait pas son chapeau en signe de respect en traversant le pont était abattu. Et beaucoup le furent. Et certains furent abattus sans aucune raison du tout. Un matin, des soldats allemands et leurs officiers entrèrent de force dans les maisons du quartier où les Juifs avaient été rassemblés, en criant que tous les hommes devaient sortir. Et les Allemands prirent tout dans les armoires et les placards. Parmi les hommes se trouvait un vieil homme portant la robe et le chapeau de la secte pieuse des Juifs qu'on nomme les Hassidim. Les Allemands lui mirent une poule dans les mains et on lui dit de danser et de chanter. Puis ils lui firent semblant d'étrangler un soldat allemand et cela fut photographié. À 3 heures, un après-midi, une cinquantaine de Juifs étaient dans une cave. Quelqu'un poussa le sac qui bouchait l'ouverture et ils entendirent une voix. « Sortez, sinon nous allons lancer une grenade. » Les SS et la police allemande, avec des bâtons dans les mains, se tenaient prêts et se mirent à frapper ceux qui se trouvaient dans la cave. Ceux qui en eurent la force furent mis en file selon les ordres et furent emmenés vers une place et alignés sur un seul rang pour être abattus. Au dernier moment, un autre groupe de SS arriva et demanda ce qui se passait. Un de ceux qui étaient prêts à tirer répondit qu'ils avaient sorti les Juifs d'une cave et qu'ils s'apprêtaient à les abattre selon les ordres. Le commandant du second groupe dit alors « C'est des Juifs gras, tous bons à faire du savon. » Ils emmenèrent les Juifs à un convoi qui n'était pas encore parti pour un camp de la mort. Et ils durent se hisser l'un l'autre dans les wagons. Maintenant, je vais vous lire le début de la deuxième partie d'un livre qui vient d'être publié tout juste. Ce livre s'intitule « Syrie, l'invention de la guerre » aux éditions Lanskin. Et cette deuxième partie est consacrée à la prison de Sednaya, qui est une prison située au large de la ville de Damas. Le monde à Sednaya et tout ce qui arrive à Sednaya. À la prison militaire de Sednaya, les autorités syriennes organisent soigneusement et méthodiquement le meurtre de plusieurs milliers de personnes depuis 2011. Les victimes sont pour la plupart de simples civils, soupçonnés de s'être opposés au gouvernement. Beaucoup de ces victimes sont exécutées lors de pendaisons de masse, au milieu de la nuit, dans le plus grand secret. D'autres victimes succombent après avoir été soumises à des politiques d'extermination, dont la torture, et à la privation systématique de nourriture, d'eau, de médicaments et soins médicaux. Les corps des victimes de Sednaya sont ensuite convoyés par camion et enterrés dans des fosses communes. Il y a 2 centres de détention à la prison militaire de Sednaya. qui peuvent rassembler chacun entre 10 000 et 20 000 personnes. Dans le bâtiment rouge, la majorité des détenus sont des civils arrêtés depuis le début de la crise syrienne en 2011. Dans le bâtiment blanc, la majorité des détenus sont des officiers et des soldats de l'armée syrienne, également arrêtés depuis le début de la crise en 2011. Des milliers de personnes détenues dans le bâtiment rouge sont tuées lors d'exécutions extrajudiciaires tenues secrètes, après avoir été incarcérées dans des conditions inhumaines. Les massacres prennent pour la plupart la forme de pendaisons de masse. Avant d'être pendues, les victimes sont condamnées à mort au cours de procès devant un tribunal militaire situé dans le quartier de Kaboun, à Damas, procès qui dure entre 1 et 3 minutes. Le jour où les autorités pénitentiaires effectuent les pendaisons, on extrait les victimes de leurs cellules dans l'après-midi. Les détenus sont listés et informés qu'ils vont être transférés vers une prison civile. Au lieu de cela, ils sont conduits dans une cellule située au sous-sol du bâtiment rouge, où pendant plusieurs heures, ils sont sévèrement battus. Au milieu de la nuit, on leur bande les yeux, puis on les transfère dans des camions de livraison ou des minibus en direction du bâtiment blanc. Là, on les emmène au sous-sol où ils sont pendus à la chaîne, l'un après l'autre. Ces exécutions se tiennent 1 ou 2 fois par semaine et entre 20 et 50 personnes sont tuées à chaque séance. On dit « Vous aurez du mal à trouver un ancien prisonnier qui avouera ce qui se passe réellement à Senaya, tellement c'est humiliant. » On dit qu'on ne sait même pas quel terme utiliser pour décrire ce qu'on a vu à Senaya. On dit que les gardiens ordonnent régulièrement à tous les prisonniers de se déshabiller et d'entrer un par un dans une salle de bain. Une fois entassés dedans, dit-on, un gardien désigne un des garçons, quelqu'un de frêle, de jeune ou de beau, et lui ordonne de rester debout face à la porte, les yeux fermés. Le gardien somme alors un prisonnier, plus imposant, d'abuser de lui sexuellement. Personne n'admettra jamais que cela lui est arrivé. Mais cela est arrivé très souvent, dit-on encore. Parfois, la douleur psychologique est pire que la douleur physique. Et les gens qui sont forcés de faire cela ne sont jamais plus les mêmes après l'avoir fait. On dit, les coups sont si intenses. C'est comme si on avait un clou. Et c'est comme si on était en train d'essayer encore et encore d'enfoncer ce clou dans du roc. C'est impossible, mais on vous somme de continuer à le faire. On dit, j'ai même souhaité qu'on me coupe les jambes un jour, pour enfin ne plus être battus. Cette politique d'extermination infligée aux prisonniers de Sednaya depuis 2011 entraîne la mort de centaines, probablement de milliers de victimes. Des procédures précises sont élaborées pour dissimuler un taux de mortalité aussi élevé. Les corps morts des détenus sont recueillis dans les cellules tôt le matin et emmenés à l'hôpital Tichrin l'après-midi. Les cadavres sont alors répertoriés dans des rapports médicaux et les certificats stipulent tous que la cause des décès est d'origine soit cardiaque, soit respiratoire. Les cadavres sont ensuite transportés par camion jusqu'à des charniers militaires aux confins de Damas. Merci.
This manual cannot teach anyone how to be a good interrogator. Its purpose is to provide guidelines for interrogation and particularly the counterintelligence interrogation of resistant sources. There is nothing mysterious about interrogation. It consists of no more than obtaining needed information through responses to questions. Interrogation rests upon the knowledge of the subject matter and on certain broad principles that are not hard to understand. What is the purpose of the interrogation? Has an interrogation plan been prepared? Is an appropriate setting for interrogation available? Will the interrogation sessions be recorded? Is the equipment available? Installed? Have arrangements been made to feed, bed, and guard the subject as necessary? Does the interrogation plan call for more than one interrogator? If so, have roles been assigned and schedules prepared? Is the interrogational environment fully subject to this interrogator's manipulation and control? What disposition is planned for the subject after the questioning ends? Is it possible to determine the subject's personal response to the interrogator? What is the interrogator's reaction to the subject? Is there an emotional reaction strong enough to distort the result? If so, can the interrogator be replaced? If the source is resistant, will non-coercive or coercive techniques be used? What is the reason for the choice? Has the subject been interrogated earlier? Is he or she sophisticated about interrogation techniques? To purify oneself and to make one's confession better, I presuppose that there are three kinds of thoughts in me. That is, one my own, which springs from my mere liberty and will, and two others, which come from without, one from the good spirit, and the other from the bad. Alternative set of procedures number 1. Stress positions. The prisoner is forced to maintain painful physical positions such as forced standing, awkward sitting, or suspension of the body from a chain or other implement for prolonged periods of time. Physical pain and suffering, long-lasting, permanent. The first two syllables hold, the last two escape. The tongue retracts in the third, it freezes and waits to heavily fall and hit in the fourth. The muscle dances as well at the beginning, stirring up, getting set. The lips are partners in crime. In the opening, the overture of disaster. Alternative set of procedures number 2. Beating. The prisoner is subjected to forceful physical contact, either directly or through an instrument. Physical pain and suffering. The absence of a bruise does not mean significant blunt trauma didn't occur. My heart beats fast. My muscles are tense. I feel dizzy. My muscles feel weak. I feel trembly and shaky. I picture future misfortunes. I can't get thoughts out of my mind. Have trouble remembering things. My face feels hot. I think the worst will happen. My arms and legs feel stiff. My throat feels dry. I avoid uncomfortable thoughts. My breathing is fast and shallow. I cannot control my brain. My palms feel clammy. I have butterflies in the stomach. The second exercise is a meditation on the sins. The first point is the statement of the sins. The second, to weigh the sins, looking at the foulness and the malice which any mortal sin committed has in it. The third, to look at who I am, lessening myself by examples. The fourth, to see all my bodily corruption and foulness. The fifth, to look at myself as a sore and ulcer from which have sprung so many sins and so many iniquities and so very vile poison. Alternative set of procedure number 6. Sleep deprivation. The prisoner is deprived of normal sleep for extended periods through the use of stress positions, sensory overload, or other techniques of interrupting normal sleep. Physical pain and suffering. Hypertension, cardiovascular disease, chronic pain syndromes. Do you remember how life was beyond the tropics? Do you remember the sound of the rain crashing against the dirty asphalt? Do you remember the ocean and its incessant breathing? Do you remember the endless canvas of the mountains shining behind the brush? Do you remember those delicious tears? Do you remember your first poem? The first point will be to see with the sight of the imagination the great fires and the souls as in bodies of fire. The second, to hear with the ears wailings, howlings, cries, and blasphemies. The third, to smell with the smell, smoke, sulfur, dregs, and putrid things. The fourth, to taste with the taste, bitter things, like tears, sadness, and the worm of conscience. The fifth, to touch with the touch, that is to say, how the fires touch and burn the souls. Alternative set of procedures number 7, sensory bombardment, noise, and light. The prisoner is exposed to bright lights, flashing strobe lights, and or loud music for extended periods of time. Physical and mental pain and suffering. EEG desynchronization, rise in diastolic blood pressure and ventricular arrhythmias, potentially life-threatening electrical rhythm disturbances of the heart. Is it possible to observe how, day after day, the ray of light which crosses through the curtains slowly crawls across the floor, millimetrically drawing the map of the seasons, the earth stretching out, the movement itself? There is no such movement inside. The world's flavor is the same every day, and the accurate search for the weakest sound among all frequencies of shrieks and shouts fails. Only the mirror is able to disclose how time writes indifference and tedium in its unsteady silver blade. Only the mirror fogs over and crystallizes all the truth in the mouth of this confinement. Alternative set of procedures number 8, violent shaking. The interrogator forcefully shakes the prisoner. Physical and mental pain and suffering. Extreme danger of trauma to the brain through an acceleration-deceleration mechanism. Bleeding of the retinal vessels, bleeding of the brain, cerebral edema. Cervical spine fracture where spinal cord compression may also occur. Ask if she thought it was a good thing to do. She answered, pass on. Ask whether the voice had forbidden her to answer everything she was asked. She said, I will not answer you that. Ask if the voice had forbidden her to tell of the revelations. She answered, I have not been advised upon that. Ask if she saw anything else with the voices. She answered, I will not tell you everything. Ask if it is forbidden for her to tell. She answered, I have not quite understood whether that is permitted or not. Ask what the voice said to her in her room when she went back. She answered, it told me to answer you boldly. Outside, the word is the antidote, although in fact, word and silence are the walls of the void, something like the limit of bewilderment. Alternative set of procedures number 9, sexual humiliation. The prisoner is subjected to sexually humiliating behavior or forced to perform sexually humiliating acts, often in an attempt to exploit cultural and religious stereotypes regarding sexual behavior and induce feelings of shame, guilt, and worthlessness. Mental pain and suffering, humiliation, indignity, lasting psychological damage, PTSD and major depression, destruction of the sense of identity and autonomy. If you stood next to me in the garden, if you stood next to this thick double corporeal nature rooted in the grass, it would begin to rain lashes and irregular pieces of mirrors. You would see the luminous scar concealed in my chest from where supposedly the real shadow once rose. You would get to see that last tear that still is salt and water hidden in my orbit. You would feel the almost non-existent murmur of a respiration and a heartbeat. That's not enough yet to be a heartbeat. Alternative set of procedures number 10, prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. The prisoner is denied contact with other human beings, including segregation from other prisoners for prolonged periods of time. Mental pain and suffering, complete dependency, severe anxiety, hallucinations, inability to think or concentrate, somatic complaints, temporal and spatial disorientation, deficiencies in task performance, loss of motor coordinations. The reeve of the leaves as the sad stretch of the incidents, the trace of the lines of the hand, the evident circulation of the venom, the torrent, the journey, the microsomal fight, the communication between adjacent vessels, the heartbeat, the incessant roar of the pulse of the existence, the cycle, the routine. Love poem by Raúl Zurita. And it's almost dawn, and I feel my tears running down my face. And they are like box cutters, the tears cutting my face. I hurt myself and I bleed, and my blood is spread all around as if I was being slaughtered.
above all things, in all things, and I can't, and I have no heart, I have no strength, I have no courage. Muchas gracias.
Voici ce qui vient de clore, donc notre soirée de lecture avec Charles Reznikoff. Et encore une fois, dans l'ordre inverse cette fois-ci, Carlos Soto roman, Frank Smith, Mark Scroggins, Sarug Sarano, Ariel Reznikoff, Jena Osman, Andrea Inglese, Stephen Fredman, Norman Finkelstein, and Dara Barnat. Merci encore.